Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of the final moments of Louis Amberg. Imagine, if you will, the borough of Brooklyn in the deep, quiet hours of the early morning. The date is October 23rd, 1935. The air is thick with a damp, clinging mist that has rolled in from the East River, wrapping the cobblestone streets in a gray, velvet shroud. It is a time when the city is caught between breaths, the heavy silence only broken by the distant, rhythmic lap of water against the rotting wood of the piers. The street lamps, spaced far apart, cast long, amber puddles of light onto the slick pavement, but they do little to pierce the darkness that clings to the brick warehouses and the iron fences of the Navy Yard. On Navy Street, the world is still, frozen in that peculiar, expectant chill that precedes the dawn. There is no wind, only the smell of salt and old iron, and the muffled sound of a lone tugboat signaling somewhere far out in the harbor. Everything feels heavy, ancient, and settled, as though the city itself is falling into a deep, dreamless slumber. In this profound stillness, a car appears. It is a 1934 Ford sedan, its dark paint shimmering under the weak glow of the lamps as it rolls slowly, almost silently, toward the curb. There is something deliberate about its movement, a slow crawl that feels more like a funeral procession than a drive. The engine hums a low, metallic vibration that rattles the glass of nearby basement windows, a sound like a growl caught in a throat. The car comes to a halt near the intersection where the shadows are deepest. For several long minutes, it simply sits there, its headlights extinguished, its shadow merging with the blackness of the Navy Yard walls. Then the faint, metallic click of a door opening echoes through the narrow street. It is a sharp, lonely sound in the void. A figure moves in the gloom, footsteps light and hurried against the stone. There is the sloshing sound of liquid being poured, heavy, thick, and pungent. The sharp, chemical scent of gasoline begins to rise, cutting through the salt air and the smell of the river, a harsh and jarring intrusion into the peaceful night. Suddenly, the darkness is shattered. A single match is struck, its tiny flame a brilliant, terrifying point of orange light in the gray mist. For a heartbeat, the flame trembles in the damp air, then it is tossed. The gasoline ignites with a soft, hollow whump, and the Ford sedan is instantly transformed into a roaring pyre. The flames climb the sides of the car, licking at the rubber seals and the glass, turning the interior into a glowing, orange furnace. The heat begins to radiate outward in shimmering waves, pushing back the cold mist and casting long, dancing shadows of the nearby buildings against the pavement. The sound is no longer a hum, but a hungry, crackling roar as the upholstery catches fire. The smell changes. The sharp tang of gasoline is joined by the acrid, suffocating scent of burning rubber and melting paint. A thick, oily smoke billows upward, spiraling toward the dark sky, a black pillar of soot that signals a violent end to the night's peace. It is an inferno on Navy Street, a bright and terrible beacon in the heart of Brooklyn. By 6 a.m, the sirens begin to wail. They start as a distant, mournful cry, growing louder and more frantic as the fire engines race toward the light. When the firemen arrive, they find the sedan still engulfed, a skeleton of glowing metal. They move with practiced, heavy steps, their boots splashing through the puddles of water and gasoline that now coat the street. The hiss of the water hitting the white-hot metal is a violent, screaming sound, sending up great clouds of white steam that mingle with the black smoke. As the flames are beaten back, the true shape of the wreckage emerges. The car is charred, its windows shattered and its tires melted into black puddles on the cobblestones. The firefighters work in a strange, focused silence, the only sounds being the splash of water and the metallic pinging of the car cooling down. As the last of the orange glow dies away, leaving only the wet, black remains of the vehicle, the men move closer to investigate the interior. The air is thick with the smell of wet charcoal and something else, something heavier, more primal. Peering into the smoldering ruins of the back seat, the firemen find a sight that will haunt the morning headlines. There, amidst the blackened springs of the upholstery, lies a bundle. It is wrapped tightly in a heavy burlap sack and bound with thick, silver wire that has bitten deep into the fabric. The heat has scorched the outer layers, but as the water douses the remains, the shape of a human form becomes unmistakable. When the authorities arrive to cut the wires, they find the nude body of Louis Amberg, the man the underworld called Pretty Lou. His head is encased in a separate cloth hood, a final act of dark ceremony. As they gently remove the coverings, they find the evidence of a brutal struggle. His skull has been shattered, likely by the heavy blow of an axe, the bone broken with a singular, devastating force. He is 36 years old, a powerful figure in the Brownsville rackets, now reduced to a grim discovery in a burned-out car. There is a terrifying stillness to the scene now, the violence of the fire replaced by the cold, clinical reality of the morgue wagons and the flashing bulbs of the police cameras. As the sun finally begins to rise over the Navy Yard, casting a pale, weak light over the scene, the true scale of the event begins to settle into the neighborhood's consciousness. This was not just a murder, it was a message. The date, October 23, 1935, would go down in history as one of the bloodiest days in the annals of organized crime. While Louis Amberg lay cooling on a Brooklyn cobblestone, miles away in Newark, the infamous Dutch Schultz was also meeting a violent end. The city was shifting, the old powers falling in a storm of fire and lead. On Navy Street, the crowd begins to gather behind the police lines, their faces pale in the early light, their voices hushed whispers as they look upon the scorched remains of the Ford. The smell of the smoke lingers in their clothes, a reminder of the inferno that had claimed the night. The mist begins to lift, revealing the mundane reality of the city waking up, but the shadows of Navy Street have grown longer, stretching into a history of blood and betrayal that we will continue to explore. For now, let the morning come slowly, and let the details of the fire rest in the quiet of your mind. To understand the smoldering wreckage found on that cold October morning, we must turn our gaze away from the river and back through the mist of time, toward the crowded, narrow streets of Brownsville. In the early 1900s, this corner of Brooklyn was a labyrinth of tenements and ambition, a place where the air was thick with the scent of coal smoke, boiling cabbage, and the heavy, sweet aroma of horse manure from the pushcart lanes. It was into this world that the Amberg family arrived in 1903, fleeing the shadows of the Russian Empire for the promise of the New York pavement. They were a large family, 5 brothers in all, but it was 3 of them, Hyman, Joseph, and Louis, who would weave their names into the very fabric of the city's nightmares. They grew up amidst the clatter of the elevated trains and the rhythmic shouting of street vendors, learning early that in a neighborhood where space was a luxury, power was the only thing that could truly be owned. The brothers did not just live in Brownsville. They began to consume it, transforming from immigrant children into the self-appointed kings of the district. Their rise was not a sudden explosion, but a slow, creeping rot that took hold of the local industries, beginning with the very shirts on the backs of the working class. The Amberg brothers understood a simple, brutal truth about the 1920s. Everyone needed their clothes cleaned. They turned their attention to the laundry and garment rackets, businesses that were the lifeblood of the Brooklyn streets. Imagine the hum of a commercial laundry in those days. A subterranean world of sweltering heat, where great iron boilers hissed like trapped beasts, and the air was so humid it felt like breathing warm silk. The floors were perpetually slick with soapy water, and the scent of bleach was sharp enough to sting the back of the throat. Under the Ambergs, these spaces became territories of war. They did not compete with better service. They competed with the sound of breaking glass and the weight of a lead pipe. If a rival laundry owner refused to pay for protection, his delivery trucks would find their tires slashed or their engines filled with sugar. If they persisted, The very buildings would be swallowed by mysterious fires that tasted of gasoline and spite. Joseph and Louis were the architects of this empire, but it was the youngest, Hyman, who was the hand of their initial violence. Hyman was a man of dark impulses, an enforcer who moved through the neighborhood with a quiet, terrifying presence until the year 1926 changed everything for the family legacy. In 1926, the eldest of the trio met a fate that would set the tone for the brothers' relationship with the law. Hyman had been arrested following the murder of a local jeweler, and he found himself staring at the damp, gray stone walls of the Tombs prison in Manhattan. The Tombs was a place of echoes and iron, where the light of the sun struggled to penetrate the grime-streaked windows. On a cold November day, Hyman and another inmate decided they would not wait for the slow turning of the judicial wheel. They managed to secure firearms, and a desperate, bloody escape attempt erupted within the prison yard. The air filled with the sharp, rhythmic crack of gunfire bouncing off the masonry. When it became clear that the walls were too high and the guards too many, Hyman chose his own end. Rather than return to the silence of a cell, he turned his weapon on himself. It was a violent, defiant exit that left Joseph and Louis to carry the Amberg name alone. The loss of their brother did not soften them. Instead, it seemed to calcify their hearts. Their mother, Rose, eventually changed her last name to Mandel, desperate to distance herself from the growing notoriety of her sons. But the Amberg name had already become a synonym for the sudden flash of a blade in the dark. By the late 1920s and early 1930s, Louis, who was often called Pretty, had become the most volatile element of the duo. He was a man of strange, jagged contrasts, obsessed with his appearance, yet possessed of a temper that could snap at the slightest provocation. There are stories whispered in the old social clubs of how Louis would use a simple dinner fork as a weapon, stabbing it into the face of anyone who dared to offer a perceived insult. One such legend claims he even attacked the comedian Milton Berle during a performance, simply because a joke felt too sharp. This was the environment the Ambergs cultivated, a world where the clink of silverware or the sound of a closing door could signal the end of a life. They held an iron grip on the garment district, squeezing the life out of unions and business owners alike. The brothers were often seen in the finest wool coats, their hats tilted at a sharp, arrogant angle, walking through the Brownsville streets as if they owned the very oxygen the residents breathed. They were the Three Kings, though by then, one throne was empty, and the remaining two were built on a foundation of shifting sand and bitter rivalries. But the 1930s brought a new kind of shadow to Brooklyn, one that was more organized and far more clinical than the Ambergs' brand of chaos. A coalition of gangs, which would later be known as Murder Incorporated, was beginning to consolidate power under figures like Lepke Buchalter and Jacob Shapiro. The Ambergs were dinosaurs in a world of new predators. They were too loud, too violent, and far too independent for the emerging national crime syndicate. As the years ticked toward 1935, the brothers found themselves increasingly isolated. They were fighting wars on two fronts, one against the law and another against the very men they had once called associates. The air in their favorite hangouts began to feel thin, as if the walls themselves were leaning in to listen. Joseph and Louis moved through the city with a constant, twitching vigilance, knowing that the loyalty they had bought with fear was starting to fray at the edges. They were men who had lived by the sword, and as the autumn of 1935 approached, the cold wind blowing off the East River carried the unmistakable scent of an ending. The stage was being set for a series of betrayals so profound that they would leave the Brooklyn underworld silenced, waiting for the first match to be struck in the dark. The air in 1935, Brooklyn was thick with more than just the salt spray from the harbor. It was a heavy, stagnant humidity that seemed to cling to the wool of every man's overcoat, carrying the scent of coal smoke and the metallic tang of the elevated trains. In the neighborhoods of Brownsville and Williamsburg, The pavement was a map of old loyalties, but those lines were being redrawn by a power that did not care for history. While the Amberg brothers moved through these streets with the loud, abrasive confidence of kings, a quieter, more systematic force was beginning to drain the color from their world. You could hear it in the way the local shopkeepers lowered their eyes when the Ambergs walked past. It was not the old, familiar fear of a local bully, but a new, chilling realization that the ground was shifting beneath everyone's feet. The independent spirit that had defined the Brooklyn underworld for decades was being slowly suffocated by the arrival of the National Crime Syndicate. This was a corporate machine that viewed men like Louis Amberg as nothing more than a stubborn error in a ledger, a jagged piece of glass that needed to be smoothed away by the relentless tide of a new order. The streets felt narrower now, the shadows longer, and the very stones of the buildings seemed to pulse with a silent, growing tension. Imagine a room swallowed by the fragrance of expensive Cuban tobacco and the sharp, clinical smell of fresh newsprint. In these high-backed chairs sat men like Charles Lucky Luciano and Louis Lepke Buchalter. They did not scream, and they rarely had to show a weapon. Their power was in the silence between their words and the calculated way they sipped their coffee from fine china. They spoke of the combination as if it were a legitimate utility company, a way to streamline the chaos of the city's rackets into a single, profitable stream. To them, the garment district was not a battlefield, but a collection of assets to be managed. Stacks of silk, rows of sewing machines, and thousands of workers whose loyalty could be bought and sold. But Louis Pretty Amberg was a man of the old world, a man who felt the weight of a heavy pistol in his pocket and believed that respect was something you carved out of a rival's skin. He was a creature of the dark alleys, a man who understood the language of the fist and the blade better than the language of a contract. Every time the syndicate sent an emissary with a polite suggestion to join the fold, Louis responded with the kind of erratic, explosive violence that made the new bosses check their watches. He was a wild, unpredictable flame in a world that was being built of cold, gray stone. The friction between these two empires was not just about money. It was about the very nature of existence. There is a story, whispered in the dim corners of the Brooklyn social clubs, of a meeting held in a back room where the walls were covered in dark, heavy velvet to dampen the sound of the street. Louis sat across from the representatives of the new order, his eyes darting like a trapped bird. The mahogany table between them was polished to a mirror finish, reflecting the flickering light of a single crystal chandelier. The men across from him spoke of board meetings and territorial boundaries, of a division of labor and a world where no one had to die unless a vote was cast and a death warrant was signed. They offered him a seat at the table, a way to turn his bloody work into a steady, quiet income that would last for decades. But Louis only saw the bars of a cage. His hands, rough and scarred from years of street fights, gripped the edge of the table until his knuckles turned the color of bone. He rejected their offer not with a counter-proposal, but with a sneer that smelled of cheap whiskey and raw defiance. To Louis, the syndicate was a ghost, a bloodless phantom trying to tell a living man how to breathe, and he would not be told what to do by men who hid behind desks. As the weeks of 1935 bled into one another, the atmosphere in the Amberg camp grew increasingly paranoid. Louis became a man haunted by the very shadows he once commanded. He moved through the city like a ghost, staying in midtown hotels under assumed names, surrounded by the smell of peeling wallpaper and the rhythmic hum of a radiator that never quite warmed the room. He kept piles of cash in his drawers and notebooks filled with codes that only he could understand, a frantic attempt to keep track of a world that was slipping through his fingers. His behavior, always volatile, tipped into something truly unsettling. He was known to carry a common dinner fork in his vest pocket, a strange and intimate weapon he would plunge into the face of anyone who dared to offer a perceived slight. Even the famous comedian Milton Berle once felt the sting of Louis's sudden rage after a joke landed poorly at the Vanity Fair Club. This was not the behavior of a professional mobster. It was the thrashing of a man who realized the water was rising above his head. Every time he stepped out into the night, the neon lights of the city seemed to flicker with a warning he could not quite read, and the sound of a passing car felt like a predator circling in the dark. The final straw was the slow, agonizing realization that his friends were no longer his own. In the underworld of the mid-30s, loyalty was being replaced by a more terrifying currency: survival within the system. Men like Mendy Weiss, who had shared bread and blood with the Ambergs for years, were beginning to look at the brothers as relics of a dying age. They saw the writing on the wall, written in the cold, precise ink of the syndicate. The organization did not just want the Ambergs gone. They wanted the very idea of the independent criminal to be erased from the memory of the city. They needed to prove that no one, no matter how pretty or how feared, was larger than the machine. The friction between the Ambergs' chaotic empire and the syndicate's cold machinery had reached a white-hot intensity that could no longer be contained. On the streets of Brooklyn, the air grew still, the kind of heavy, breathless stillness that precedes a devastating storm. The Ambergs were still walking, still talking, still collecting their protection money from the terrified shopkeepers. But to the men in the high-backed chairs, they were already ghosts. The ledger had been balanced, the final vote had been taken, and the only thing left was the sound of a car engine idling in the deep, velvet darkness of a Brooklyn night. The silence in the Midtown Manhattan hotel suite was a heavy, physical thing, pressing against Louis Amberg's chest like a lead weight. For 10 long months, he had existed within these 4 walls under an assumed name, a ghost haunting the heart of the city while the world he once ruled outside began to fracture and bleed. The room smelled of stale cigar smoke, expensive hair tonic, and the metallic tang of unspent adrenaline. On the mahogany nightstand sat a gold watch that did not belong to him, its steady, rhythmic ticking the only heartbeat in the room. Beside it lay over $1,000 in crisp, cold cash and a stack of ledgers filled with cryptic codes, his life reduced to numbers and secrets. He was the last of the Amberg brothers, a solitary figure standing in the wreckage of a dynasty. Hyman was long gone, and Joseph had been cut down just 23 days prior, lined up against a cold garage wall in Brownsville and erased. Louis could still feel the phantom chill of that September morning, a reminder that the shadows were growing longer, and the list of people he could trust had dwindled to a terrifying 0. He moved to the window, the fabric of his silk robe whispering against the floorboards, and looked out at the flickering lights of 1935 New York. The city felt different tonight. The air was thick with the scent of an approaching storm, and the metallic ozone of a shift in power that he could sense, but not yet see. When the telephone finally rang, the sound was like a gunshot in the stillness of the room. Louis hesitated, his hand hovering over the receiver, his fingers trembling almost imperceptibly. It was Mendy Weiss on the other end, an old friend whose voice carried the familiar, comforting rasp of the Brooklyn docks. Mendy spoke of a peace offering, a white flag raised by the rivals who had spent the last month hunting the Ambergs like sport. He suggested a meeting, a dinner to settle the blood feuds and divide the territories before the city tore itself apart. Louis wanted to believe him. He needed to believe that there was still a way back to the life he knew, away from the suffocating safety of this midtown hideout. He dressed with meticulous care, sliding into a suit of fine wool and a coat with a velvet collar that felt soft against his neck. He checked his reflection in the tarnished silver mirror, smoothing back his hair, trying to ignore the way his eyes looked sunken and tired. He was pretty Lou, a man who had built an empire on laundry bags and loan sharking, and he would not meet his fate hiding in a rented room. As he stepped out into the hallway, the carpet muffled his footsteps, making him feel like a spirit already passing through the veil. The elevator ride down to the lobby was an eternity of polished brass and mirrored panels, each floor a second closer to the threshold he was about to cross. The night air of October 22nd was damp and clinging, a mist rolling off the East River to coat the cobblestones in a slick, black sheen. Louis stepped into the waiting sedan, the leather seats cold and smelling of rain and old exhaust. The driver remained silent, a shadow behind the wheel as they began the long journey toward Brooklyn. As the car climbed the arch of the bridge, Louis watched the dark water churning below, the whitecaps looking like jagged teeth in the moonlight. The city's skyline was a jagged silhouette of granite and steel, beautiful and indifferent to the man crossing into the heart of the storm. He thought of his brothers, of the way the Amberg name used to make the streetlights flicker with fear in Brownsville. Now it felt as though the very architecture of the city was turning its back on him. They moved through the quiet streets of the Navy Yard district, where the air grew heavy with the smell of salt, diesel, and rotting timber. Every alleyway seemed to hide a figure, every flickering lamp a signal. The paranoia that had been a dull hum in his hotel room was now a screaming siren in his mind, but he forced himself to stay still, his gloved hands folded neatly in his lap. He was approaching the Wolf's door, the point of no return where the hunters and the hunted would finally meet face to face. The car pulled up in front of Yiddle Lorber's restaurant, a place that should have felt like home. The windows were fogged with the steam of boiling pots and the warmth of a dozen conversations, the yellow light spilling out onto the sidewalk in inviting pools. Louis stepped out of the car, the transition from the cold night to the humid air of the restaurant hitting him like a physical blow. The smell of roasted meats and garlic was thick, almost suffocating. Mendy Weiss was there, waiting with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, his hand extended in a gesture of brotherhood that Louis desperately wanted to trust. They sat at a corner table, the clatter of silverware and the low murmur of the other patrons providing a false sense of normalcy. Mendy leaned in, his voice a low conspiratorial whisper, talking of the future and the riches that awaited the last Amberg standing. But beneath the table, Louis could feel the floorboards vibrating with the heavy footsteps of men moving in the shadows of the kitchen. Yiddle, the proprietor, approached them with a bottle of fine rye and 2 glasses, his face a mask of practiced neutrality. He invited them to the back, to the privacy of the kitchen for a special toast to their new alliance. It was a request that sounded like a command, a gentle push toward the darkness that lay behind the swinging wooden doors. As Louis stepped through those doors, the warmth of the dining room vanished, replaced by the sharp, sterile chill of the industrial kitchen. The sound of the restaurant faded instantly, cut off by the heavy thud of the door closing behind him. The light here was harsh and unforgiving, reflecting off the stainless steel surfaces and the long, sharp knives hanging from the magnetic racks. He saw them then, the boys from the combination, the faceless enforcers of the new syndicate who had been waiting in the silence. There was no talk of peace now, no white flags, only the cold, mechanical efficiency of a trap finally sprung. The air in the kitchen grew thick with the smell of copper and fear. Louis turned to look at Mendy, but his old friend had already stepped back, his face vanishing into the shadows of the hallway. The realization hit Louis with the force of a tidal wave. He had walked into the wolf's den with his eyes wide open, lured by the ghost of a loyalty that no longer existed in the Brooklyn of 1935. Outside, the clock on the wall ticked toward the early hours of October 23rd, the final moments of the Amberg reign. The city slept on, unaware that in a quiet corner of the Navy Yard, a glistening new sedan was being prepared for a journey it would never finish, its back seat destined to become a funeral pyre for the last of the brothers. The flickering orange light of the burning sedan cast long, dancing shadows against the worn brickwork of North Elliott Place. The morning air of October 23rd, 1935, was a biting, damp mist that clung to the industrial skeleton of the nearby Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was shortly after 5 in the morning, a time when the city is usually caught in a deep, heavy slumber, but the silence was shattered by the crackle of a localized inferno. As the heat intensified, the acrid smell of burning rubber and gasoline drifted through the narrow streets, a heavy, suffocating scent that announced a gruesome discovery. A lone witness, shivering in the pre-dawn chill, watched from a distance as several dark figures sprinted away from the flaming vehicle, their forms dissolving into the thick fog like ghosts. The car, a metal tomb swallowed by fire, sat directly across from 131 North Elliott Place, its paint blistering and peeling back like charred skin. When the first responders arrived, the metal was still too hot to touch, the heat radiating off the chassis in shimmering waves that distorted the view of the quiet Brooklyn street. They waited as the flames were tamed, the thick black smoke slowly giving way to a gray, ghostly haze that revealed the horror resting on the back seat. Inside the skeletal remains of the car, the investigation began with a silence so profound it felt heavy. Louis Amberg, the man who had clawed his way to the top of a criminal empire, had been reduced to a nameless bundle of ash and wire. The scene was a masterpiece of organized cruelty. He had been stripped entirely of his clothing, a final act of humiliation intended to leave him with nothing. His head was encased in a coarse, woven laundry bag, a heavy fabric that had partially melted and fused with the violence of the night. But it was the bindings that truly chilled the seasoned detectives of the New York Police Department. His hands were not merely tied. They were intricately lashed with thin, biting silver strands of steel wire. This metal web didn't stop at his wrists. It snaked around his neck and coiled down his arms and legs, a cold, metallic cage that ensured he could not move, even in his final moments of consciousness. The precision of the wirework spoke of a professional hand, a signature that was becoming disturbingly common in the borough of Brooklyn. It was the work of men who did not just kill, but who treated the act of murder as a meticulous, industrial process. The detectives who gathered at the scene moved with a weary, practiced rhythm. Their heavy wool coats absorbed the dampness of the morning as they circled the smoldering sedan. One senior investigator, his face illuminated by the dim, gray light of the rising sun, was asked if there were any immediate suspects in the slaying of the man they called Pretty Amberg. He looked out over the skyline of the city, at the endless rows of tenements and the looming cranes of the shipyard, and simply replied, "Yeah, Brooklyn." It was a statement of exhaustion, a recognition that the violence had become a part of the city's very geography. This wasn't a simple crime of passion or a spontaneous robbery gone wrong. This was the fifth major gangland hit in a matter of weeks, and the patterns were becoming impossible to ignore. The murder of Louis Amberg bore a striking, terrifying resemblance to the hit on his brother, Joseph, who had been gunned down just 23 days earlier. The city was witnessing the birth of something new, a systematic approach to execution that favored efficiency over ego. The detectives knew that every thread of the laundry bag and every twist of the wire was a message, though they were only just beginning to learn the language of the syndicate. Seeking to understand the life Louis had led in the shadows, the investigation drifted from the charred remains in Brooklyn to the sterile, quiet hallways of a midtown Manhattan hotel. For 10 months, the man who lived by the blade and the gun had been hiding in plain sight under an assumed name. In his room, the air was still, heavy with the scent of expensive tobacco and the faint, lingering aroma of bay rum cologne. The detectives moved through the space with gloved hands, sifting through the remnants of a secret existence. They discovered more than $1,000 in cash tucked away, a fortune in those lean years, along with a collection of jewelry that Louis had no right to possess. Among the items was a gold watch, its surface polished to a mirror shine, bearing initials that did not match any of the Amberg brothers. But the most significant find was a series of records and diaries. These were not written in plain English, but in a dense, mathematical code. The pages were filled with names and addresses, a cryptic map of the underworld that suggested Louis was far more involved in the intricate finances of the mob than anyone had realized. Each coded entry represented a debt, a deal, or perhaps a death sentence. As the sun finally broke through the heavy New York clouds, the connections began to crystallize in the minds of the investigators. The signature of the laundry bag and the wirework was not the mark of a lone assassin, but the calling card of a burgeoning group of killers for hire. This organization, which would eventually be whispered about in the halls of justice as Murder, Incorporated, was operating with a clinical, detached cruelty. They were the enforcement arm for a new national syndicate, led by figures like Lepke Buchalter and Gura Shapiro. These men had no room for the chaotic, loud-mouthed violence of the Amberg brothers. Louis had been a relic of an older, more personal era of crime, and his messy, public feuds had become a liability to the new business model of the mob. The laundry bag was a tool of containment, a way to transport a human being like a piece of freight. The wire was a guarantee of silence. As the detectives closed the door to the hotel room, the investigation shifted from a search for a killer to a struggle against a shadow. The death of Pretty Amberg was not the end of a war, but the finalization of a corporate takeover, written in blood and sealed with fire. The morning of October 23, 1935, arrived with a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep out from the very stones of the Brooklyn Navy Yard. It was 5:30 in the morning when the first flicker of unnatural light caught the eye of a lone witness near the corner of Navy and North Elliott Place. Across from the soot-stained brickwork of 131 North Elliott, a Ford sedan sat huddled against the curb, swallowed by a blooming crown of orange and violet flames. The fire did not roar. It crackled with a rhythmic, sickening snap, the heat melting the rubber seals of the windows until they ran like black tears down the doors. The air was a heavy, suffocating tapestry of smells. The acrid bite of burning gasoline, the sharp chemical sting of melting upholstery, and a deeper, more primal scent that made the throat tighten. As the firemen arrived, their heavy canvas coats damp with the morning mist, they found the car's interior transformed into a furnace of secrets. The metal groaned as it cooled under the spray of the hoses, a high-pitched, metallic keening that echoed off the surrounding tenements like a final, desperate cry for mercy. When the smoke finally thinned into a pale, gray gauze, the investigators leaned into the wreckage to find what remained of Louis Pretty Amberg. The scene was a masterwork of underworld brutality, a message written in wire and ash. He had been stripped of the fine, tailored suits he loved so dearly, left naked and vulnerable in the back seat of the sedan. A rough burlap sack had been pulled over his head, a final gesture of anonymity and disrespect. His hands and legs were bound with thin, silver-colored picture wire, the metal coils biting deep into the charred skin where the heat had tightened them like a vice. It was not just the fire that had taken him. The autopsy would later whisper of shotgun wounds and the jagged marks of an axe. This was not a quick execution. This was a slow, methodical dismantling of a man who had spent his life thinking he was untouchable. The syndicate, through the hands of the notorious Murder Incorporated, had turned Pretty Amberg into a heap of smoldering silence, marking the end of the independent racketeer in the city of New York. To understand the weight of this silence, we must look back at the shadow the Amberg brothers cast over the 5 boroughs. They were the wild men of Brooklyn, a triad of brothers who operated with a chaotic ferocity that the new order of crime could no longer tolerate. Hyman, the youngest, had already met his end years earlier in 1926, choosing a self-inflicted bullet in the Tombs prison yard over a life behind bars. Then, only weeks before Louis's final morning, his brother Joseph had been cornered in a Brownsville garage on September 30th. Joseph and his chauffeur were lined up against a cold, grease-stained wall and executed in a hail of lead that mimicked the infamous Valentine's Day massacre. The Amberg name, once a source of terror that made even the hardest men in Williamsburg lower their voices, was being systematically erased from the ledger of the living. Louis had tried to hide, moving from hotel to hotel under assumed names, his pockets heavy with over $1,000 in cash and jewelry he could never wear. But the shadow of the syndicate was longer than the reach of his fear. The death of Louis Amberg solidified a new reality for the streets of New York. The era of the colorful, independent gangster, the man who answered to no one but his own impulses, was replaced by the cold, corporate efficiency of the Commission. Murder Incorporated, led by the calculating Lepke Buchalter and the ferocious Albert Anastasia, had turned killing into a business with a board of directors. They preferred the silence of a dark alley and the anonymity of a burning car to the loud, public spectacles of the Roaring Twenties. The Ambergs had been a nuisance, a remnant of a disorganized past that the syndicate needed to pave over. On the very same day that Louis was found in the ash, the legendary Dutch Schultz was being gunned down in a Newark steakhouse. It was a day of transition, a violent cleaning of the house that left the Commission as the undisputed masters of the city's heartbeat. The power shifted from the street corners to the quiet, mahogany-paneled rooms where death was decided with a nod of the head rather than a shout in the street. As the years stretched into decades, the physical reminders of that morning on North Elliott Place began to fade. The cobblestones were layered over with thick, black asphalt that muffled the sounds of the modern world. The tenements where the Ambergs grew up were torn down or renovated, their walls scrubbed clean of the secrets they once held. Their mother, Rose, had long ago changed her name to Mandel, trying to wash the notoriety of her sons from her family tree. But history has a way of lingering in the air, like the smell of ozone before a storm. If you walk through the quiet streets of Brooklyn late at night, when the fog rolls in off the East River and the yellow streetlights hum with a low electric vibration, you can almost sense the echoes of that era. You can imagine the heavy tires of a Ford sedan turning the corner, the smell of gasoline on the wind, and the terrifying silence of a power struggle that reshaped the skyline. The Amberg legacy is not found in monuments, but in the stillness that follows the fire. The world has moved on, turning the brutal realities of 1935 into the soft, blurred edges of a ghost story. The names of the brothers are now just ink in old police files, footnotes in the long, dark history of a city that never stops moving. The flames that consumed Louis Amberg have long since cooled, leaving behind a peace that was bought with blood and iron. The city sleeps now, its lights twinkling like distant stars, oblivious to the ghosts that walk the docks and the alleyways of its past. We leave them there in the quiet shadows of the Navy Yard, where the smoke has cleared and the echoes have finally fallen silent. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.